The lake hadn't changed. Still and silver, it mirrored the heavy sky, framed by the pines that had always seemed to hold their breath this time of year. Late September made everything quieter, softer, like the earth itself was preparing to let go. I stood on the narrow dock, the damp wood cool beneath my boots, my old Nikon hanging around my neck like a forgotten part of myself. It had been years since I came back here. Years since I let myself remember what this place meant. What it used to mean. The cabin behind me stood in shadow, its windows reflecting the last light of the day. The same cracked shutters. The same sagging porch swing. It was strange, how a place could be frozen in time while everything inside you had shifted so completely. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of wet leaves and smoke drifting faintly from some distant chimney, and for a second, I was 12 again, barefoot on this very dock, my mother's laughter echoing from the water's edge. It was a memory so old I didn't trust it, not entirely. But I held on to it anyway. The truth was, I hadn't come back for nostalgia. I hadn't even come back for the lake. I came because she was gone now, and someone had to go through her things. Pack the books. Sort the boxes. Cancel the electricity. Sell the land. And because part of me, small and silent, hoped I might find something of myself here, too. The wind picked up, brushing strands of hair into my face, and I tightened my fingers around the camera. It still worked, somehow. Despite everything. I hadn't touched it in years, not really. Not for myself. Not since New York. Not since the gallery closed. Not since I made the choice to step away from everything I thought I wanted. Back then, I had told myself I was doing the right thing, choosing stability, safety, something solid. Leaving the city, finding a real job, building a life with Matthew. But the cost of that decision had slowly grown heavier with time. At first, it had been easy to ignore, the hollow ache in the mornings, the tightness in my chest when I saw someone with a camera slung across their shoulder, the way my fingers twitched when light hit something just right and I didn't capture it. And then, one day, I simply stopped looking. The shutter clicked before I could stop it. A reflex. I caught a frame of the lake just as the wind scattered a ripple across its surface. The sound startled me, familiar, but jarring. Like hearing a ghost whisper your name. I lowered the camera and stared out across the water, where the hills rose like old memories, distant and half-formed. I could still remember the rhythm of summer mornings here, coffee in chipped mugs, Dad's canoe scraping against the shoreline, the smell of toast and honey. Those details were trapped in amber now, unreachable. But they were there. The chill in the air settled beneath my coat, and for the first time in years, I felt the flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Not joy. Not yet. But maybe the space where joy could grow. Behind me, the porch creaked. A bird called from somewhere deep in the trees. The rest of the world had fallen away. For the moment, it was just me and the lake and the quiet. I brought the camera back to my eye. The viewfinder narrowed my world instantly, sharpening it into light and contrast, shapes and lines. I focused on a lone branch dipping toward the surface, catching the last blush of orange from the sky. Click. The sound reverberated through my chest like a heartbeat. That was the thing about photography. It made everything more real by making it smaller. One frame at a time. One truth at a time. I used to believe that if I could just capture something the right way, I could make sense of it. That through a lens, even pain could be beautiful. Maybe that was naive. Or maybe it was the only way I ever learned how to understand the world. I glanced down at the camera in my hands. The grip was smooth from years of use, the rubber worn away in places. There was a crack near the bottom of the body, a scar from the time I dropped it in Budapest, trying to catch the light on a woman's face as she fed pigeons in the square. I'd kept shooting anyway. Some of those photos ended up in my first exhibit. It felt like another life now. A version of me that had burned too brightly and burned out too fast. A sound behind me, soft, deliberate, made me turn. A woman stood at the edge of the trees. She was older than me by maybe 10 years, with salt and pepper hair tied back in a loose bun and a flannel shirt layered over a faded t-shirt. Her boots crunched against the leaves as she stepped closer. "You must be Claire," she said, her voice low and even, like someone who didn't rush anything. "I'm June. Your mom's neighbor." I nodded, caught off guard. "Hi. She told me you might be coming by. Said you'd probably head straight to the lake." June smiled, but there was sadness in it. "She always said this is where your heart lived." The words hit harder than I expected. I blinked, looking back out at the water. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I guess it did. Once." June stepped up beside me, giving me space. "I just came to check if you needed anything. Fridge should still be running, but the pipes can be finicky when it gets cold this quick." "Thanks. I'm okay." She nodded. "Well, if you change your mind, I'm just through the trees. Red house. Can't miss it." She started to turn, then paused. "It's good you brought your camera." I looked down at it, surprised. "You know about that? Your mom used to talk about you. Said when you were little, you'd take pictures of everything, mud puddles, shadows, your own feet." Her smile softened. "Said you saw the world different. Like it all mattered." I didn't know what to say to that. The lump in my throat was sudden and sharp. "She was proud of you, you know," June added, almost gently. "Always was." The silence after she left felt bigger somehow. The kind that stretched out over years and 1,000 missed phone calls. I turned back to the lake, the camera still warm from my hands. I hadn't even meant to bring it. It was in the closet, still in the old leather bag, and I'd grabbed it at the last second, more out of habit than intention. But now, I wondered if it had been something else. Some quiet part of me reaching for what I'd let slip away. The clouds had deepened. The light was almost gone. I raised the camera one last time and snapped a photo of the dock itself, the planks worn smooth, the edges chipped, the lake holding the reflection of a sky in transition. A moment that wouldn't last. A frame to remember it by. The wind rose sometime after midnight. It howled through the trees like it had something to say, rattling the windows and tugging at the old shutters with wild, grasping fingers. I hadn't meant to fall asleep on the couch, but the warmth of the fire and the weight of the day had pulled me under before I even noticed the sky had gone dark. When I woke, the fire was just embers and my neck ached from the lumpy cushions. The silence inside the cabin was so complete it rang in my ears. I blinked at the ceiling, heart thudding for no reason I could name. Then. Knock ***. Sharp. Sudden. Real. I sat up fast. Another knock, slower this time. 2 beats. Then a pause. Then one more. Not hurried. Not frantic. Just deliberate. The kind that made your gut twist before your brain even caught up. I stood, the blanket tangled around my legs, and moved toward the door without turning on a light. The porch was wrapped in darkness, the trees beyond barely visible in the night. The lantern I'd left by the steps was out. Or maybe it had never been on. I hesitated with my hand on the doorknob. Knock. Again. "Who is it?" I called, my voice lower than I expected, steady but thin. Silence. I waited. Listened. Nothing. Just the wind. My fingers tightened, and I opened the door. He stood just past the porch rail, half in shadow, his jacket soaked, hair damp and curling from the rain that had started without my noticing. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. I knew him the second our eyes met. Mason ***. The name hit me like cold water. It had been 7 years. 7 years since I'd seen him last. Since I'd said goodbye and meant it. Since we stood in the middle of a too bright gallery with our dreams bleeding between us and walked away in opposite directions. He hadn't changed much. Older, sure. His jaw sharper. A A little more tired around the eyes. But the weight he carried, it was the same. Like he'd seen too much of the world and brought pieces of it home with him. I took a step back without realizing it, one hand still on the doorframe. "Mason," I said, and it wasn't a question. He nodded once, his voice low. "Hey, Claire." The way he said my name, soft, familiar, unraveled something I'd only just begun to stitch back together. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked at me like he didn't know where to begin. I didn't know where else to go. Something in his voice was wrong. Off. Not weak, exactly. But raw. What happened? He glanced away, jaw tight, rain dripping from the edge of his collar. "I was passing through. Heard about your mom. Thought. I don't know. Thought I should check in." I didn't believe him. Not entirely. "You came all this way to check in?" I asked, my arms crossing instinctively. "After 7 years?" Mason exhaled, the sound more pain than breath. "No," he admitted. "Not just that." The storm chose that moment to hurl itself harder against the trees. Thunder rolled low in the distance. He flinched, just slightly. And for a second, just a second, I saw it. The crack in him. The same kind of fracture I'd been walking around with since I left the city. The same ache of not knowing who you were anymore. "Come inside," I said, stepping back. "You'll freeze out there." He hesitated. Then crossed the porch slowly, brushing past me with the kind of careful energy people use when they know they're not really welcome, but they hope they might be. Inside, the fire had died down to a whisper. I grabbed a few logs and stoked it back to life, grateful for something to do with my hands. Mason stood near the door, dripping, his eyes scanning the room like it was a memory he'd forgotten he had. "You kept it," he said, nodding toward the photograph above the mantel. It was one of mine. One of the few I hadn't boxed away. A black and white shot of the lake at dawn, mist curling like breath across the surface. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But, it felt wrong to take it down. It's still one of your best." I looked over at him. "You used to say that about everything I shot." His smile flickered and disappeared. "Not everything." Silence stretched between us, thick with the things we hadn't said. The choices we hadn't forgiven. I poured him coffee, and we sat across from each other in the tiny kitchen, the table between us too narrow to feel like real distance. "What are you running from, Mason?" I asked finally. His eyes found mine and didn't flinch. "Everything." A beat. "I burned out," he said, his voice a rasp. "Too many flights. Too many countries. Too many stories that didn't want to be told." "You walked away from the best photojournalism gig in the country." "I walked away from myself," he said. "And by the time I realized it, there wasn't anything left worth staying for." I swallowed. Hard. He wasn't talking about the job. He was talking about me. "You could have called," I said. "I didn't think I had the right." "You didn't. But I would have answered anyway." His shoulders dropped slightly, the tension bleeding out slowly. "I never stopped following your work," he said. "Even after everything. There hasn't been much to follow." He looked up at me then, eyes sharp. "That's not true." I wanted to look away. I wanted to pretend his words didn't hit like they did. But I couldn't. He reached into his coat and pulled something from his bag, an envelope, creased and damp around the edges. He slid it across the table. "What is this?" "Something I found a few weeks ago. In my mother's attic. Your handwriting was on the back." I opened it slowly, carefully. It was a photograph. One I had taken. Of him. From a trip to Portugal, years ago. He was standing on a cliff, the wind pulling his jacket open, his hands tucked into his pockets, staring out at the sea like it was the only thing holding him together. "I thought I lost this," I whispered. He nodded. You gave it to my mom. Said she should keep it, because you didn't want to. The room felt too small. My breath too loud. I kept a copy, he said, quietly. All these years. I met his eyes, and something shifted. Broke open. This wasn't about just grief. Or closure. Or a stormy night and an old flame showing up out of nowhere. This was a reckoning. Why now, Mason? He held my gaze. Because I couldn't outrun it anymore. And maybe I hoped, you couldn't either. I didn't sleep. Not even after Mason fell silent and the fire settled into a soft, glowing hush. Not after he stretched out on the couch with his coat still half on, his body curled into the cushions like someone afraid to take up too much space. I sat in the armchair across the room, one leg tucked under me, the blanket tied around my shoulders, the camera resting in my lap like it might explain something if I held it long enough. Outside, the wind had quieted. The rain was just a whisper now, tapping against the windows like a song only I could hear. And still, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. The one I'd taken so many years ago and left behind. The one Mason had kept. Why? That question had wrapped itself around everything since he walked through the door. Why now? Why me? Why did the sight of him, damp, exhausted, and too familiar, make something inside me ache like it never really healed? I looked at him in the soft firelight. His features relaxed now, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before the gallery, before the offers, before the pressure of making it in a world that never slowed down. Back then, it was just us, two kids with cameras and big dreams, capturing beauty because we didn't know what else to do with the pain. But time had changed that. Had changed us. And now? Now I didn't even know who I was anymore. The couch creaked softly as Mason shifted. His eyes opened slowly, blinking at the firelight before landing on me. A quiet pause settled between us, thick with the kind of tension that only comes from shared history. You didn't sleep, he said, voice hoarse. Neither did you, I replied. He sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Couldn't. The air here's too quiet. I'm not used to it anymore. You used to love the quiet. He gave a faint, humorless smile. I used to love a lot of things. I looked down at the camera in my lap, the words catching in my throat. Why did you keep that photo? I asked. Mason looked at me, really looked at me, like he had the night before. Because it was the last time I saw myself clearly. His voice was quiet, but the weight of the words landed hard. I've seen hundreds of pictures of myself since then, press passes, interviews, snapshots on other people's feeds, but none of them felt real. That one? You took it before all the noise. Before the world started demanding answers I didn't know how to give. I swallowed hard. My fingers curled around the edge of the camera. You could have told me. Back then. How lost you felt. And you could have told me you were afraid, he said, not unkindly. I flinched. Because he was right. I had been terrified. Of failing. Of not being good enough. Of loving something more than I could hold on to. We both had been. I didn't think you'd understand, I said. I didn't, he admitted. Not then. A long silence followed. Then Mason stood and crossed the room, kneeling in front of the fire to stir the coals. He worked without speaking, the glow dancing across his face. What happened to us, Claire? He asked quietly, still facing the fire. The question hit a nerve I'd been avoiding for years. I think we started wanting different things, I said. You wanted the world. I wanted to stop spinning. He turned slightly toward me, eyes shadowed but intent. And did you? Did I what? Stop spinning. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. I had traded the chaos of New York for a quiet life in Vermont. Traded ambition for comfort. Art for structure. Matthew had given me all of it. A stable job. A steady house. Even talk of a future that sounded more responsible than passionate. And yet, I hadn't picked up my camera in years. Not until yesterday. Not until here. Not until Mason. I tried, I said, finally. But I think I just pressed pause. He nodded slowly, as if that made sense. As if it echoed something inside him, too. I burned out, he repeated, sitting back on his heels. And not just from the job. From the person I had to become to keep up with it. He looked down at his hands. They were weathered, a little rough, the knuckles scarred from years on the road. They looked like hands that had seen too much and held too little. You still shoot? I asked. He shook his head. Not really. Sometimes, when I can't sleep. Or when the light hits just right. But not the way I used to. Not for truth. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. Claire, he said softly, why did you really stop? I wanted to say it was just life. That things shifted. That I had grown out of it. But that would have been a lie. I was afraid it wouldn't mean anything anymore, I whispered. That all the work, all the vision, none of it mattered. Not if I couldn't make a living from it. Not if people stopped looking. Mason's eyes softened. It still matters. Even if no one's looking. Especially then. The tears surprised me. They came slow and silent, sliding down my cheeks before I even realized they were there. I brushed them away quickly, embarrassed by how easy it was for him to get inside my head again. To crack me open without trying. He didn't speak. Just sat there while I pulled myself together. The fire popped softly. A log shifted, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Then Mason said something I hadn't expected. Do you remember the abandoned motel outside Kingston? I blinked. The one with the orange doors? He smiled. And the room numbers all peeling off. I nodded. You made me climb onto the roof to get the sunset. Said it was the only place you could see the horizon. It was, he said. Still the best light I ever shot. I let out a breath that felt too much like a yell. Afraid he might be right. The phone rang just after noon. Mason had gone for a walk, said he needed air, space, time to think. Or maybe he just knew I needed all of that more than he did. I watched him go from the porch, his figure swallowed by the trees until even the sound of his steps faded into silence. I was halfway through a mug of reheated coffee when my phone vibrated against the table, the name flashing across the screen in sharp white letters. Matthew. I froze. It rang again. I hadn't told him I'd left town. I hadn't told him anything, really, beyond I just need some time. I didn't know what I expected from him, not a fight, not questions, but not silence either. I let it ring twice more before I answered. Hello? Claire. His voice was clipped. Controlled. Too calm to be real. Hey. A pause. Then, where are you? Straight to the point. Typical. I'm at the lake, I said quietly. My mom's place. A beat. You could have told me. I wasn't ready to talk. Well, I'm guessing you're ready now. The edge in his voice was subtle, but it was there. Underneath the restraint, underneath the careful words. A slow burn waiting to rise. I stood and walked to the window. The rain had returned lightly, misting the grass and dripping from the porch rail. The lake looked like glass again. She's gone, Matthew, I said. I needed to be here. I know, he said, softer now. I get it. I wish I was part of it. Part of this. You are, I wanted to say. But the words felt dishonest in my mouth. He continued before I could speak. You've been different for months, Claire. Even before this. You stopped picking up your camera, you stopped showing up. I've been trying to be patient, to give you room, but I didn't ask for room, I said, sharper than I meant. No, he agreed. You didn't. You just took it. Silence cracked through the call like a fault line. I'm sorry, I said after a moment. I don't know how else to explain it. He sighed. Then try. I turned away from the window, leaning against the wall, phone pressed tight against my ear. I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted, the words raw. Being here, back in this house, back near the lake, it's like I've remembered parts of myself I didn't even realize I buried. There was a pause on his end. I could hear him breathing, steady and slow. Are you alone? The question snapped my spine straight. What? He repeated it, quieter. Are you alone? I didn't answer right away. My heart thundered in my chest. And maybe it was guilt, or shame, or the simple inability to lie anymore, but I said it. No. Mason's here. Dead silence. I imagined his jaw clenching. The shift in his expression. I could practically feel the temperature drop on the other end of the line. Mason, he said. Your ex. He showed up. Unexpectedly. He's just staying one night. You didn't mention that last night. I didn't know he was coming. And now he's just there? I closed my eyes. He needed a place to land. I know how that sounds. You're right, Matthew snapped. It sounds like you're letting your past walk through the door and make itself at home. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that would make it sound better. I trusted you, he said, quieter now. And that cut deeper than anger. I didn't do anything, I whispered. But you thought about it. His voice was so quiet I barely heard it. But I did. And it was enough. I need space, Matthew. Just a few more days. He let out a short breath. And then what, Claire? You come back and pretend nothing's changed? Or are you trying to decide whether you're coming back at all? I don't know. There it was. The truth. Heavy and final and terrifying. He was silent again. When he finally spoke, his voice was brittle. Okay. Okay? I'll give you your space, he said. But I won't wait around forever for someone who doesn't know if she wants to be with me. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone like it had betrayed me. Like maybe, if I stared hard enough, the past hour could rewind itself. I set it down slowly and walked back toward the fire, arms folded tightly around myself. I hadn't meant for this to happen. Hadn't meant for Mason to show up. Hadn't meant for any of this to turn into a choice. But it had. And now? Now I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Mason returned just after 1. He came in quietly, brushing water from his sleeves, shaking the chill from his hands. He looked at me, eyes searching, then paused. You okay? I nodded. A lie. He took a breath like he knew it. Matthew called. He raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. He knows you're here. Still silent. I waited for him to say something, an apology, a joke, anything to break the air, but he just stood there, still and calm. I told him you showed up unexpected. That nothing happened. Did you mean it? I blinked. What? That nothing happened. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't pushing. He just asked, like it mattered. Like the truth mattered. I looked away. I don't know what's happening, I said. I don't know what this is. He nodded slowly, stepped forward, closer, but not too close. I'm not here to make it harder, he said. You already did. He winced slightly. Then I'll go. I looked up sharply. What? If that's what you want. If my being here just makes things worse. And the terrifying thing? I didn't know if it did. Because somehow, it also made things clearer. I don't want you to go, I said. But I don't know what I'm doing. And Matthew, he's been good to me. He's steady. Safe. Mason didn't flinch. I'm not asking you to run away with me, Claire. I'm not that guy. Not anymore. I just want you to be honest, with him, with me, with yourself. My throat closed. I nodded. He stepped back, giving me space. I'll take the spare room tonight, he said. And tomorrow, if you still want me gone, I'll leave. He turned and walked upstairs, his footsteps slow and heavy. I stood there in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the echoes of everything I couldn't undo. The fire crackled low. The rain tapped against the roof. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't just about love. It was about truth. And I had to choose mine. The forest was still damp from the storm, the leaves slick beneath my boots, the air sharp with the clean scent of pine and decay. I followed the old trail behind the cabin, the one I used to take as a kid when I needed to disappear, when the house felt too loud, or too quiet, or too full of expectations I didn't know how to meet. This time, I wasn't running. Not exactly. I had the camera slung around my neck, its familiar weight pulling me back into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd missed. With each step, I felt more awake. More alert. I was noticing things again, the way the moss clung to the bark, the curve of a fallen branch, the way light filtered through the canopy and turned the air golden in places. It was like the world had been waiting for me to open my eyes again. And I had no idea how long I'd kept them closed. The path narrowed near the ridge, where the ground dipped and the lake appeared again in the distance, framed by the trees like something sacred. I paused there, letting my breath slow, raising the camera. Click. The shutter broke the silence like a pulse. I adjusted the lens, crouched lower, framed the curve of the trail as it disappeared into the fog ahead. Another shot. Then another. And with each one, something inside me loosened. I wasn't thinking about Matthew. Or Mason. Or the life I had carefully constructed and was now carefully questioning. I was just here. Seeing. Feeling. Remembering. A gust of wind stirred the branches, and the sound of movement caught my attention, something just beyond the frame. I turned sharply, expecting a deer, or maybe June's dog who wandered the woods sometimes. But it wasn't an animal. It was a figure. Standing at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught. Matthew. He looked completely out of place, his city jacket soaked at the edges, shoes caked with mud, hair tousled from the wind. He wasn't supposed to be here. I hadn't told him where I was going. Just that I needed time. How did you? I called June, he said, stepping into the clearing. Of course. My stomach twisted. She shouldn't have. She didn't want to. But she also didn't want me driving in circles around the lake for hours. He paused. You weren't answering. I lowered the camera slowly, my hands suddenly cold. You shouldn't have come, I said. I had to, he replied, his voice low, taut with something I hadn't heard in a long time. You left without saying goodbye, Claire. You walked out of our life like it didn't cost you anything. I flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? He moved closer, but I stayed rooted to the spot. This place, he said, glancing around, whatever it is. It's not the real world. It's memory. Grief. Nostalgia. You can't stay in it forever. I don't want to stay in it forever. Then come back. I don't know if I can. The words came out before I could stop them. Honest. Heavy. Matthew's expression faltered. You don't know if you can, or if you want to? I looked at him, really looked at him. The man I'd built a life with. The man who always paid the bills on time. Who never forgot to lock the door. Who loved me in the safest way possible. And suddenly, that didn't feel like enough. I've been gone from myself for years, Matt, I said, my voice cracking. And I didn't even realize it until I came back here. Until I picked up this camera. Until I started seeing again. He stepped back, the hurt flickering across his face like a slap. And Mason helped you see, he said flatly. My chest tightened. This isn't about Mason. Of course it is. He's part of who you were. The dreamer. The risk-taker. The girl who didn't want to be grounded. And you think that's a bad thing? I asked, my voice rising. That chasing something uncertain makes me irresponsible? That choosing art makes me lost? No, he said. I think pretending you're happy when you're not is what makes you lost. The words hit harder than I expected. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees like it was trying to fill the silence for us. I love you, he said quietly. I closed my eyes. Let the ache settle into my bones. I know, I said again. But that's not enough anymore, is it? I didn't answer. And that was the answer. He looked away, nodding slowly. You're going to stay here for a while. I think I have to. He didn't argue. Just stepped back, turned around, and started walking the way he came, down the trail, toward the lake, toward the road that would take him home. I stayed behind. Frozen. Fractured. Free. Later, I found myself standing back at the edge of the ridge, the place where I first stood when I arrived, where the trees opened just enough to see the water stretch wide and open. I raised the camera again. The viewfinder narrowed my world, calmed it. A single beam of light broke through the clouds, hitting the surface of the lake like a promise. Click. Another frame. Another truth. And just beyond the lens, a figure appeared again. Mason. Watching me from a distance, waiting without pressure, the way he always used to when I was trying to find the right shot. His hands were in his pockets. His eyes unreadable. But this time, he didn't need to say anything. I knew what I had to do. I lowered the camera and turned to face him. Not ready. But willing. The sky cracked open just after dusk. A single streak of lightning split the horizon, followed by a low rumble that rolled through the trees like a warning. I stood barefoot on the porch, the old planks cool beneath my feet, rain dripping from the eaves in steady rhythm. Behind me, the cabin glowed with soft lamplight. Warm. Familiar. But nothing about me felt steady anymore. Inside, my bag sat by the door, packed, half-heartedly. As if choosing to leave were as simple as zipping up a suitcase. It wasn't. Mason sat at the kitchen table, his elbows resting on the worn wood, hands folded like he was holding something fragile between them. Neither of us had spoken much since Matthew left earlier that afternoon. There was too much weight in the air. Too many words trying to surface all at once. The door creaked as I stepped back inside, the air between us stretching, tight as piano wire. You're leaving, Mason said. Not a question. I don't know. He nodded, his expression unreadable. But you packed. I needed to see how it felt. And? I looked at him. Really looked. The boy I'd loved once, now a man I didn't quite recognize, but still knew. Still felt. It feels like closing a door I'm not ready to shut. He looked down at the table, his jaw tightening. I told you I'd go. If that made things easier. It doesn't. I walked to the other side of the room, leaned against the doorway to the den. My eyes landed on the photograph over the fireplace again, my own work, staring back at me like a challenge. Like a mirror. I've spent so long choosing what was safe, I said softly. What looked good on paper? What made sense? Matthew was dependable. Kind. Stable. And I told myself that was enough. It's not, Mason said quietly. No. It's not. I turned back toward him. But I don't know if I'm ready for the rest either. For everything you and I were. Everything we broke. We were young, he said. Too hungry. Too sure of ourselves. We thought passion was enough. We didn't know what it meant to carry each other through the hard parts. And now? He stood, crossed the space slowly. Now I know that love isn't just fire. It's staying. Even when the light fades. Even when the frame isn't perfect. I felt the air shift between us. My breath caught. I'm not asking you to run away with me, Claire, he said. I'm asking if you remember what it felt like to be seen. To be known. Not because someone loved the version of you they wanted, but the version you really are. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to fall into that memory. Into the way he used to make me feel like I could touch the sky just by raising my camera. But I couldn't, not yet. Because part of me was still standing in that small kitchen back home, with Matthew's quiet voice echoing in my head, asking if I still wanted the life we built. Asking if I was capable of staying when the ache inside me refused to go silent. I need to be alone, I said. Mason nodded once, but I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. I'll walk the ridge, he said. Give you space. And he left without another word. I sank into the armchair, the storm rumbling again in the distance. The air was thick, electric. I looked down at my camera resting on the side table. It felt like the only thing that still made sense. Without thinking, I grabbed it and stood. Stepped outside into the rain, barefoot again, walking across the porch and down the steps, the earth cold and soft beneath me. I didn't stop until I reached the field behind the cabin, wild and untamed, tall grass swaying in the wind, the sky above split with streaks of dark violet and steel. And there, at the edge of the trees, Mason stood, back to me, head tilted toward the horizon, like he was listening to something only he could hear. I raised the camera. Framed him in the distance. And hesitated. This moment, it wasn't about him. It was about me. About the choice I was finally ready to make. I lowered the lens, stepped forward. My heart pounded in my chest like it was trying to outrun everything I'd held back. Mason, I called. He turned slowly. His eyes found mine instantly. I didn't wait. I walked straight to him, past the hesitation, past the ghosts, past the part of me still clinging to the illusion that I could live with half a heart. When I reached him, I stopped just short. The wind tossed my hair into my face. Rain soaked through my shirt. But I didn't care. I remember, I said. He didn't speak. I remember what it felt like to be seen by you. And I remember what it felt like to lose myself after I let it go. I took a breath. I don't know what this is anymore. What we are. But I know I don't want to keep living someone else's version of my life. I want to choose something messy. Something uncertain. Something that might hurt. His eyes didn't waver. I want to choose truth, I whispered. He reached for me then, but not with urgency. With care. With reverence. His hand found mine. And just like that, the space between us disappeared. 1 year later. The gallery was small, modest. Tucked into the corner of a quiet street near the lake. But it was mine. Photographs lined the walls, each one a piece of something I'd reclaimed. A girl in Portugal. A ridge kissed by sunset. A silhouette standing in the rain. The final frame in the center was different. It was a self-portrait. A single shot taken through a mirror, my eyes half-shadowed, my camera obscuring half my face, but not hiding it. Because I wasn't hiding anymore. From the door, Mason watched me adjust the last label, his arms crossed, that same quiet pride in his expression. He didn't say much these days, not about the past, not about where we'd been. But he stayed. He believed. And I kept shooting. Because some stories don't need neat endings. They just need to be told.